there is a strange kind of danger that no one warns you about. It's not physical, and it's not immediate. It doesn't show up in the form of threats or violence. In fact, it often wears the mask of enlightenment, clarity, and insight. It's the danger of seeing something true too clearly. The moment you perceive a truth that others can't, or won't, see, a rift opens between you and the world. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and philosopher, understood this more deeply than most. He knew that discovering truth is not just an intellectual act, it's a transformation of the self. It breaks down your previous worldview, often violently, and replaces it with something you can't unsee. And here's the problem: the world around you usually doesn't change with you. It stays the same. People remain in denial. Social systems still run on illusions. Friends and family may still cling to comforting stories. But you're no longer able to pretend, and that can be isolating, terrifying, even dangerous. Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." So what happens when you face yours and theirs remains hidden? We romanticize truth. We imagine that awakening to deeper realities will bring peace, happiness, and purpose. And sometimes it does. But sometimes it brings chaos. Because the moment you see something others don't, or refuse to, you become a mirror. Your presence alone becomes confrontational. People feel it. They sense that you're no longer buying into the shared illusions. And that makes them uncomfortable, even hostile. Jung called this shadow projection the psychological mechanism by which people unconsciously project their denied flaws, fears, and contradictions onto others. If you become more conscious, more whole, more awake, you will start to reflect their unconsciousness. Not because you're trying to, but because your existence challenges their narrative. And most people would rather destroy the mirror than see what it's showing them. So they'll push you away, label you arrogant, call you crazy, dismiss your insights. Not because you're wrong, but because you're right, and that's too much for them to handle.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
And the hardest part, you can't go back. Once you see the machinery behind the curtain, it doesn't matter how much you want the old illusions, you can't unknow what you know. You start to notice how society is built on distraction, how people numb themselves to avoid inner silence, how conversations circle endlessly around surface-level things, how the deepest truths about suffering, meaning, mortality, the unconscious are never mentioned unless someone breaks. You try to bring it up gently, but people change the subject, or they laugh, or they get defensive. And so you learn to keep your insights to yourself. Not because you doubt them, but because you realize that truth has a weight, and not everyone is ready to carry it. Jung warned us, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he also implied the cost: isolation, misunderstanding, exile. Because becoming who you truly are often means no longer fitting where you once belonged. So what do? Do you silence yourself to belong? Do you dilute your truth to keep your friends? Do you pretend not to see what's obvious to you, just to avoid conflict? Or do you let go of approval, of comfort, of the need to be understood, and walk the lonelier road? That's the real risk of seeing truth others can't. It's not that you'll be attacked, though that's possible. It's that you'll be alone. Not forever, but for a while. Because the deeper you go, the fewer people there are who have gone with you. You become like a diver going into the ocean's depths, while others are still playing in the shallows. And you can't yell up to the surface and expect to be heard clearly. You have to decide, is the truth worth the silence, the distance, the space between you and the rest of the world? But here's where it gets even more intense. When you carry truths others can't see, you become responsible not for saving them, but for holding that truth with integrity. That's the real weight. You can't force people to wake up. You can't shove insight down their throats. That's not enlightenment, it's aggression. You have to learn patience, compassion, the ability to be with others even when you see through them. Not in judgment, but in love. Jung believed that true individuation, the process of becoming a whole, conscious person, meant integrating not just your light, but your darkness. And part of that darkness is the temptation to feel superior when you see more clearly. But clarity is not superiority, it's responsibility. The more you see, the more gently you must walk. So ask yourself, what truths have you glimpsed that others don't want to hear? What parts of yourself have you had to hide because they made other people uncomfortable? Have you ever felt the loneliness of knowing something that no one else around you understands? If yes, you're not broken. You're becoming. But becoming is not easy. It's not glamorous. It's not a straight line. It's a spiral, a shedding, a burning away. And yes, it's a risk. But not taking that risk? That's a greater danger. Because when you refuse to see, you don't just stay safe, you stay asleep. And life is too short to sleep through what matters most. The truth may cost you comfort, but it will buy you reality. And reality, however hard, is where freedom begins. The invisible burden, how carrying unshared truths reshapes your identity. Once you've seen something that others can't or won't see, you begin to carry an invisible burden. It's not just the weight of the truth itself, it's the psychological and emotional tension of holding it alone. Carl Jung understood this intimately. He explored not just the awakening of consciousness, but the aftershocks that follow. When you begin to transcend collective illusions, social, moral, even existential, you don't just drift from others. You begin to drift from the version of yourself who once belonged easily, who once conformed without resistance. And that version begins to dissolve. And it's not always peaceful. Sometimes it feels like a death. Because in a very real way it is. You start to realize that the person others think you are is no longer real. That identity no longer fits. The mask begins to itch. The roles you used to play feel hollow. And yet you're still surrounded by people who expect you to keep playing them. That inner split, that doubling of the self, is one of the deepest sources of suffering for those who see what others can't. You begin to live in two worlds, the one that is and the one that pretends. And this is where the transformation of identity begins, not as an act of self-expression, but as an act of self-preservation. You start to withdraw, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. You grow quiet, not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that speaking truth in the wrong room can make you a target. You start to watch people more closely. You notice the way they avoid eye contact when the conversation gets too honest. You see how they change the subject when something real enters the room. And each time that happens, it confirms the unspoken law. There are truths you are not allowed to speak. Not if you want to be liked. Not if you want to belong. And so, without realizing it, your identity begins to shift. You become someone who holds things inside. Someone who edits their soul in real time to make others comfortable. And this creates a deep inner pressure, a longing to be seen. But not just seen without having to shrink. Here's where it gets even more paradoxical. The more you evolve, the harder it becomes to explain yourself. Language starts to fail you. Because the truths you now carry are not just intellectual, they're experiential. You've lived them. They've shaped the way you see reality. And how do you explain a shift in perception to someone who hasn't experienced it? How do you describe color to someone who's only known black and white? You end up using metaphors, symbols, poetry, anything to bridge the gap. But often the gap remains. And so, you feel misunderstood. Not because you're unclear, but because you've crossed into territory most people haven't dared to explore. Jung called this the individuation process, the journey of becoming whole. But he never promised it would be easy. In fact, he warned that it would often feel like exile. Because to become whole, you must leave behind the comfort of being normal. But here's the secret no one tells you. Over time, the burden becomes a gift. Not because it gets lighter, but because you get stronger. You begin to build a new identity, not based on external validation, but on internal alignment. You stop asking, will they accept me? And start asking, am I being true to myself? You begin to value solitude not as loneliness, but as clarity. You find your voice again, not the voice that pleases, but the voice that reveals. And slowly you attract others who are on the same path. People who don't flinch at truth. People who've seen their own shadows and won't be scared of yours. People who've carried their own invisible burdens and recognize the weight in your eyes. And when you find those people, something incredible happens. You don't have to explain yourself anymore. You can just be. But even then, the risk remains. Because the deeper truths you carry, the ones that touch the soul, are often truths that change you forever. And change, even the good kind, always comes with loss. You lose the old you. You lose the comfort of certainty. You lose the ability to live in blissful ignorance. But in that loss, you gain something far greater: integrity, to depth, realness. You gain the ability to walk through the world without lying to yourself. And that, in a shallow world, is a revolutionary act. So ask yourself again, what truths are you carrying that no one else sees? What part of you have you hidden to keep others comfortable? And what would it cost you to stop hiding? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're the only ones worth asking, because they lead you to the only place worth going, not just to truth, but to yourself. The sacred loneliness, why seeing deeply means walking alone, but it's worth it. There's a moment in every seeker's journey where the silence becomes deafening. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the existential silence, the kind that follows the loss of shared illusions, but the kind that arises when you realize you've outgrown the conversations, the comforts, and even the communities that once made you feel alive. Carl Jung knew this deeply. He often described the path to individuation as one of radical solitude, not because we crave isolation, but because those who see deeply have no choice but to walk alone for a while. And this loneliness isn't just physical, it's spiritual. Because once you've seen through the masks of society, through the ego games, through the collective refusal to look inward, you can't unsee it. And in that seeing, a space opens between you and the world. There's sacred space. But sacred doesn't mean easy. Sacred doesn't mean painless. Sacred means necessary. And often, the most necessary things are the ones we try hardest to avoid. What makes this solitude sacred is not that it feels good, it usually doesn't. What makes it sacred is that it forces you to meet yourself fully, without distraction, without performance, without the usual scaffolding of identity propped up by other people's expectations. In this space, you begin to hear the voice beneath the noise, the voice of your true self. The one that doesn't care whether you're liked or successful or admired. The one that isn't interested in fitting in, but in waking up. And that voice, once heard, changes everything. It doesn't offer comfort. It offers clarity. It doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It tells you what you need to know. And that knowing cuts through illusion like fire. It burns away the false self. And in the ashes, something real begins to emerge. But here's the paradox. The more real you become, the harder it is to pretend. Pretending starts to feel like betrayal. You find yourself in rooms where everyone is laughing, and yet you feel like you're watching a play. You hear people talking, but no one's really saying anything. And you wonder, was it always like this? Or did I just not notice? The answer is both. It was always like this, but now you notice. That's the price of consciousness. You don't just wake up to yourself, you wake up to the world. And much of what you see is tragic. The way people numb themselves. The way we glorify distraction. The way we mock depth and worship surface. The way we avoid silence because we're terrified of what it might reveal. And yet, in the midst of that tragedy, there's also something beautiful. You're no longer asleep. And that matters more than you know. This sacred loneliness is not a punishment. It's a rite of passage. It's the desert every mystic, philosopher, and truth seeker has walked through. It's the space where illusions die and the soul breathes for the first time. It's where you stop asking, who do they want me to be? And start asking, who am I really? And the answer doesn't come in a flash. It comes in fragments, in stillness, or in tears. In long nights where you wonder if you've lost everything only to realize you've finally started to find yourself. And in that process, something extraordinary happens. You become whole. Not perfect, not finished, but real. And realness is rare. Realness is sacred. Realness is the foundation of all true freedom. But even then, loneliness will visit you again and again, not because you're broken, but because depth is rare. And the deeper you go, the fewer people you'll find at that level. This can be heartbreaking, but it can also be empowering. Because once you accept that loneliness is part of the path, it stops being scary. It becomes liberating. You no longer need to be understood by everyone. You no longer seek validation from those who haven't done the inner work. You stop shrinking your truth to make others comfortable. And instead, You begin to radiate from within. You begin to trust your own experience. But you begin to love yourself, not the mask, but the soul beneath the mask. And that love, once awakened, becomes your anchor. It becomes the quiet power that allows you to walk through the world without apology. So let me ask you again, are you willing to be alone if that's what it takes to be real? Can you carry your truth, even if no one claps for it? Can you love the path, even when it's empty and silent and slow? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're doorways, and only you can decide whether to walk through them. But know this, the loneliness doesn't last forever. Not if you keep going, because eventually you do find others, people who speak the same soul language, people who've walked through their own deserts, people who don't need you to be anything but true. And when you find them, the sacred loneliness becomes sacred connection, not the kind built on performance, but the kind built on mutual seeing. And that kind of connection, that's the deepest kind there is.